All right, let's see. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. So, well, welcome everyone. I'm appreciative of you coming out tonight. I'm going to spend some time talking with you about framing research questions. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be general because I know we may have people from multiple disciplines here tonight. So I'm going to try to give you some general guidelines that could apply to a lot of different types of research that you may be doing, and also look at it from several different paradigms looking at quantitative and qualitative design. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask those. I think it'll be helpful to address those in the moment so that it's making sense to you and we don't get too far along and you fall behind on your understanding. So I want to start off by having you take a moment and look at this image. And so take a moment and if you want, jot down some notes or think in your head, what do you see in this image? All right, you could look at these as individual pictures. You could look at them as separate pictures. All right, so hopefully something came to mind that you saw in these. So I'll start on the right-hand side. At the top, you see a taco. All right, and so hopefully that was familiar to everyone. You see a taco. On the bottom, we have a dinosaur. And I'll come over to the left-hand side in a moment. But if you put taco and you put dinosaur for the pictures on the right-hand side, how did you know that when you saw those images? How did you know that was a taco? All right. Have you had tacos before? Maybe you have an affinity for tacos. Some type of past experience potentially came up for you, particularly living here in South Texas. It's a staple for many individuals. How about the dinosaur? How did you know that was a dinosaur? I'm going to venture, not knowing who's in my audience tonight, but I'm going to venture that none of you were around when the dinosaurs roamed the planet. So you don't have any firsthand experience with dinosaurs. So perhaps you learned about them in school, in books, television, movies. And depending on where you gained your information, your perspective on dinosaurs and what you know about them varies. Are they friendly? Are they ferocious? Are they plant eaters, meat eaters? So all of that, we got information elsewhere. Now let's look at on the left-hand side. So we have this picture of this girl. And there may be some variation in what people saw in this picture. Is she frightened? Is she excited? Nervous? Perhaps multiple mixed emotions. How did you know, whatever you wrote down that you saw, how did you know that's what you saw? Are these experiences that you've had, emotions that you have felt? And so the reason why we go through this activity to start is part of our jobs as researchers is to understand how we as individuals interact with the world around us. The way in which we take in information, the way in which we interpret the world around us shapes the way we perform as researchers. In turn, it shapes the type of research questions that we ask in the work that we do. So how do we acquire knowledge? Think about all that you know to this point in your life. And it's probably only a small fraction of all there is to know. Where did that knowledge come from? How did all of that information about the world get packed into your head? And then later on, we'll talk about how you access that. Well, when we talk about knowledge acquisition, we really talk about knowledge coming from three general categories. The first is from authorities or experts. And so on the left-hand side, we see the young woman learning some mathematical formulas. Who are the authorities and experts that we have had in our lives? Well, early on, it was probably your parents, your family. As you started to grow and mature and get into the school-age years, it's your teachers become the experts. You move into your teenage years, and it's your friends, peer groups that become the experts. And then as we grow into adults, we start branching off and we find different groups of experts that speak to us and become trusted sources of information for us. They may be researchers, civic or community leaders, scientists, church elders, or politicians. All of these groups, these experts and authorities, help us understand information. And they become sources where we could go to acquire new information. A second source of knowledge acquisition is our cultural beliefs. Who we are and where we come from determines a lot of how we gather information. Whether you are consciously aware of the fact or not, your values, ideas, and beliefs are shaped by your culture. These beliefs we have are malleable. They change over time. Some may remain static, but think of your own life. Do you have the same beliefs and ideas and values now that you did as a small child? In many cases, individuals share values and beliefs with close family members. As they grow and mature, venture out on their own, engage with individuals from other cultural backgrounds, their perspectives change. They broaden, and new ideas are integrated into existing ways of thinking. A third source of knowledge, illustrated by the center picture here, is our personal and sensory experiences. We take in information from our senses, what we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Those of you who have had human development coursework in your graduate programs or perhaps in your undergraduate programs, think of small children, infants, and how they interact with the world. They put things in their mouth. Taste becomes a way of learning about the world. For many of us, those sensory experiences continue into adulthood and beyond. We have to practice and try things for ourselves. We have to see it to believe it. So all of these become sources of information that we take in. So this brings us to one of the philosophical sciences that underlie a lot of how we understand the world, and in a research sense, how we go about conducting research, is this idea of ontology. And so when we talk about ontology, we're talking about a philosophical study that's going to really focus on identifying and understanding what exists in our known world. What do we consider reality? So we think about the world around us. What is real? What do we know to be constants and truths in our world? How do we know of its existence? Is it truly seeing is believing? Or are we able to make deductive reasoning where if we have enough facts and evidence that seem to lead to a suggestion, it engenders beliefs in us? Ontology becomes the starting point for all research then. As a researcher, it's critical for you to become in tune with your ontological persuasion before you engage in research activities. In other words, you need to take a moment to critically self-analyze how it is that you know and understand truth in the world. That perspective you have becomes a bias in your research lens. Not necessarily a bias in a negative sense, but it is something to consider. Generally speaking, ontological persuasions fall into two camps: realism and relativism. Within these camps, there are subcategories as well. And I'll go through these quickly to give you an example. In the realism category, we have what's called naive realism. Naive realism is the idea that reality can best be understood using appropriate methods. All right. We could make our best guess deduction of what's going on. So I can know by looking at my watch what time of day it is, that if it's around anywhere between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's going to be a little more hectic getting off the island here at campus. There's only really one true way off, and that's a busy time when people leave. I don't need to necessarily conduct research. I don't need to keep records of that. I can understand it using appropriate methods. I've experienced it before. I could look out my window and see traffic. And I know a general rule of thumb, that's when campus starts to kind of clear out and transition between day and evening classes. Structural realism is reality being described by scientific theory. The underlying nature of reality remains unknown, so we don't know why it is, but we can identify what it is. And we do that using the scientific method, conducting studies, analyzing our results. A third type of realism is critical realism. This is reality captured through broad critical examination, relying on multiple observations or data collections to get at a true sense of what phenomena is occurring and what is real. Opposite of realism is relativism. And within the relativism, we have two subcategories. We have bounded relativism and then relativism by itself. The bounded approach looks at mental constructions that we have that are equal in space and time within boundaries. These are beliefs that we have that seem to extend across time, across situations, across environments. They're general rules of thumb that we have about how the world operates. True relativism looks at reality as existing in multiple intangible mental constructs. In other words, there's no reality beyond subjects. We all create our own realities. And so we know expressions like perception is reality. Each individual will have their own viewpoint on what's real. So think about where you see yourself falling in these various persuasions. Now, you could have multiple. It is not a black or white issue where it's one and not the other. But you probably have a preference. You have a default in terms of how you like to understand your world. As a researcher, you may recognize that realism tends to align well with quantitative designs, needing to gather data and somehow observe and analyze that data to find out what's real. Whereas relativism aligns more with the qualitative inquiry, understanding that reality is subjective and we need to hear the voice and experience of those individuals we are researching. So what is truth? If you ask yourself, what is the truth? What does that term mean? What does it mean for you for something to be true? Does it have to be absolute? Does it have to be able to stand up to any condition? Does it have to be meaningful to you? Does it have to agree with your beliefs and ideas? As researchers, we need to think about, how do we know what is truth? Conversely, popular in culture today, what is fake news? What do we identify as that is not truthful? And then what separates the two? So here's an example of an ancient Indian parable. And it's been used a lot of different ways. The story has changed in many different ways. But in its original iteration, it was a group of 6 blind men who come upon an elephant. And these blind men each come up to a different part of the elephant. And using their sense of touch, they reach out to try to feel around and identify what is reality in their world. And they begin to describe to one another what it is that they believe is in the room with them. And of course, since they're relying on touch and they're each touching a different part of the elephant, they each come up with a different interpretation of what's before them. The individual grabbing the tusks talks about feeling large spears, great weapons. The individual holding the trunk of the elephant describes a large hose. The individual touching the ears says, no, it's a blanket. The individual grabbing the leg describes it being a tree trunk. The individual touching the hindquarters feels like it's a giant wall. And lastly, the individual who's pulling the elephant's tail says it's a rope. Well, in one iteration of this parable, the individuals begin to argue and fight, believing that the others are trying to confuse them and share with them false information. Why do they believe it's false information? Because it contradicts their perception based on the part of the elephant that they are touching. And so the moral of this parable is that as human beings, we have a tendency to claim absolute truth based on our limited subjective experiences. Oftentimes, we ignore other people's subjective experiences, which may be equally true. As a result, we're often left with a very limited view of the world around us. So as a researcher, as you're venturing into this stage of your careers where you're going to begin conducting original research, you want to try to avoid being one of these 6 blind men who go into this experience and have their subjective experiences and believe that to be the universal truth, and remain closed to the possibility that there are other perspectives out there. Effective researchers realize that there are probably multiple understandings that we need to capture in our research. The second one of these philosophical sciences is this idea of epistemology. So whereas ontology looks at what's real, epistemology looks at where this knowledge comes from. It's looking at the origin and the nature of our understanding and the methods we use to expand that knowledge and understanding. Epistemology helps us differentiate between what's known as true knowledge and false knowledge. True knowledge is adequate. It allows us to answer the research questions that we're posing. False knowledge is inadequate. It leaves us with remaining questions or unaddressed areas. So as you're thinking about epistemology, questions you should be asking yourself: what is knowledge? And that's going to vary depending on your discipline and the type of study you're trying to conduct. In an educational setting, if we just ask students at the end of a semester, you went through this class, why don't you tell me what grade you think you deserve based on your experiences? That's going to give us perhaps a limited sense of knowledge. What's the nature of that knowledge? So again, where is it coming from? What's the credibility of the sources? And then, is that knowledge valid? Is it truly answering the questions you need it to be answering? So a couple other visuals for you to consider. When we talk about epistemologies, there's really kind of three main epistemologies that we consider: objectivism, constructivism, and subjectivism. Objectivism is meaning existing within an object. In other words, reality is fully material and objective. We could look at a construct, a phenomena, an image, and we could almost universally come up with the same understanding of what's going on. So if we look in the upper right-hand corner, there's an image of some fishermen. If I were to ask you the question, what do these gentlemen do for a living? Or what are these gentlemen doing in this photo? We would almost unanimously come up with something related to fishing. That understanding came from the material cues in that image. It did not require us to pull from our backgrounds, our experiences, our understandings. Even if you've never been fishing yourself, you likely came to that deduction that these were fishermen in that photo. So that's objectivism.
Dr. Watson, we have a question.
Constructivism comes from meaning being created from an interplay of a subject and an object. In these situations, the subject, the participant, they construct the reality of the object. We look on the right-hand side, or the left-hand side, excuse me, we see an image of a roller coaster. When I see this photo, it brings up fear and anxiety. I do not like roller coasters at all. I honestly can't even fathom how some people find them enjoyable. They are very anxiety provoking for me. If I'm in an amusement park or a fair and I see roller coasters, just walking by them, my palms start to get sweaty. But for you, they may be a sense of joy and excitement. You may relish riding roller coasters. In fact, that may be the first thing that you run to when you're at one of these amusement parks. So the meaning of this experience, riding a roller coaster, is external. The subject and their unique experiences change the meaning of the activity. For me, it's fear. For you, it's excitement.
Dr. Watson?
And then finally, subjectivism. Meaning exists within the subject. There's not an exchange between them. As the participant, as the individual, we impose meaning on the object. And so on the bottom, we have money. Money by itself is just paper. The inherent value in meaning of money is something we impose on it. We're able to exchange these little pieces of paper for goods and services because we put the meaning on it. We attach the value to it. So you have these three different epistemology perspectives from which you could come from as a person, a human being, and also as a researcher. So now we can put it all together. Understanding that backdrop of how we conceptualize truth and knowledge, where we believe truth and knowledge comes from, and how we go about gathering it, allows us to now start framing our research studies. And when it comes to the research question in particular, framing is a critical part of what we're doing. When framing our research questions, we're going to begin with this theoretical and sometimes empirical antecedents. What you're gathering from your review of the literature. You're building the case for what needs to be addressed. That review of the literature leads to your research questions. And your research questions address those gaps in the literature. What is it that we as a profession still do not know? What is the next logical step we should be taking in our understanding of this field? That question then sets in motion the type of design that we should be doing. So your research questions guide your research designs. A lot of times we hear students and beginning researchers identify themselves as quantitative researchers or qualitative researchers, almost as if that is a singular identity, that I only perform those types of designs. Well, that subjective view often leads to some bias, where you are now looking at the research field that you have and limiting the questions you could ask to fit the design that you are going in already having in mind. So it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. Let your question motivate your design. So what are your research questions? A research question should help you define what it is you hope to learn when you conduct a study. It essentially is the boiled down 15-second explanation of why you're conducting this research. Research questions should expand our understanding of a field. All new research that's created should be advancing what we know. Now, those advances could be a few millimeters all the way up to several kilometers. It doesn't necessarily matter how much you're adding to the field. The key is that you are adding something new. And so this idea of developing your research questions is a critical component, whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative research. So how do you come up with research questions? I'm willing to bet that at some time in your research careers, you often wondered, boy, it sure would be a lot easier if they would just give me a question to research. sometimes we as researchers, we get stuck. We can't figure out what is the question that I should be asking. What is going to really resonate with my readers and make my research meaningful? As you're pondering some of these ideas and what your research questions should be, there are several sources that you could go to and tap into to find what you should be researching. First, you could review the literature. And when I talk about literature here, I'm talking about it from the broader context of what do we know about a field? What are some of the theories, best practices, guidelines or principles that we have? Known ways of performing or being? How have those evolved over time? Chances are in your field, what individuals believed 100 years ago, 50 years ago, in some cases even 5 years ago, is not what the field believes today. Our perspectives change with new information as it becomes available. So review the literature and get a sense of what is prevailing thought in your field. More specifically, you could look at previous studies. Now we're getting into the research components. Individuals who have conducted research, gathered and analyzed information, and are presenting their results. What did these previous studies find? In almost every research article that you read, there's going to be sections at the end that talk about implications for future research. Despite these studies, what is still left unknown? What do these authors identify as potential next steps that we can go? Reading through these studies, you'll begin to see emerge some consensus on what's missing in the field, where we need to go next. And thirdly, you can rely on your experience. What types of professional and personal experiences do you have in the area in which you're researching? So if you're in an education program and you're looking at curriculum design and you've been a classroom teacher before, what have been your experiences? What has worked? What hasn't worked? What has been challenging? What has been beneficial? All of that comes together and is synthesized and condensed to give us information gaps. And those information gaps then are where you focus your research. Your research questions should be formulations of those information gaps. What you're going to be able to do to close the gap and bridge the gap between what we know and where we need to go. Generally speaking, there are 3 types of research questions that you could ask. In quantitative studies, you could look at descriptive questions, where you're wanting to know what's going on and what exists. Relational questions that are geared more at looking at how variables seem to relate to one another. In these relational designs, we're looking at correlations without causation. These variables are co-occurring, but not necessarily predictive of one another. That comes in the third type of question when we look at causal questions. Causal studies allow us to start making some of those cause and effect relationships. We can begin to understand how manipulation of one variable may affect outcome on other variables. From those general questions, you may pipe down and have smaller questions, which we call implied questions. The general research question, which forms the foundation or basis for why you do the research, may have several segments to it. Different types of implied questions that we could have. At the descriptive level, you could be looking at existence. Does a phenomena exist? For example, how many first-generation college students are enrolled here at Texas A&M Corpus Christi? We could look at classification. Now we start breaking up into subsections of the population. How many first-year students, second-year, third-year students? How many graduate students? We may also have descriptive questions that are more comparative in nature. How does one group compare to another? Students who take online courses versus students who are in a traditional face-to-face campus-based program. At the relational level, we could have questions that are compositional in nature. What components seem to go together and make up positive sense of self? What components go together to create an ideal educational curriculum? We could have relational questions that are simple interactions. We don't necessarily have to have large-scale relationships, so we could look at relations at a more of a micro level. Perhaps we're looking at, instead of just a K through 12 school system, we're looking at fourth graders, eighth graders. Under the causality question, we could start looking at comparisons and then interactions as well. Manipulation of one variable and how it affects the others. And that domino effect that will allow us to make predictive designs. So as you come up with your research questions, there's going to be some offshoot to them. As a researcher, it's important for you to think about what is really the root of what you want to do with this study. Thinking of the end game, what do you hope the information that you gather is going to allow people to do? Being aware of where you want to go with your research will help you position the type of research you do, the questions you ask, and the data you collect to get to that ultimate goal. So when we're talking about framing quantitative research questions, this idea of framing comes down to positioning this research question so that it encapsulates all the different components of your research design in that question. When you're developing a research question, you could use this acronym right here, this P code. Your research question should touch on these 5 elements. P stands for population. Who is the group to which you hope to generalize your results? I stands for intervention. What is it that you are doing in your research design? C stands for comparison. If you are comparing multiple groups, identify who those groups that you're comparing are. Or if you're relating one method to another, identify those elements. O stands for outcome. What's the outcome or the dependent variable that you have for your study? Student performance, therapeutic gains. Right? So whatever it is that you are trying to measure and assess. And T stands for time. So what's the time element of your study? So when writing a good quantitative research question, I should, as a reader, be able to know from reading your question what you did, the intervention, what you are comparing that intervention to, so whether it's to a control group, a treatment as normal, to another experimental condition. I know the outcome, what I hope to be, what I'm measuring as my dependent variable. I know the time that you did it. So is this over a semester, over a year, over a 3-week period? And I know the population that you are trying to generalize your results to. Including all that information helps readers understand the value of your research. Now, if you're a qualitative researcher, here are some framing questions that you could consider. Questions that you could ask yourself and use as almost a template for different types of designs. If you're looking at a biographical type study, you could ask the first question. If I could discover the meaning of one person's lived experience, I would ask whoever that person is about whatever experience you're interested in. The second question lends itself well to a phenomenological approach. If If I could discover the shared lived experiences of one quality or phenomenon in others, I would want to know about blank. Question 3 relates to ethnographic studies. So you had the opportunity to experience a different culture by either living in it or observing it. You would choose to experience blank, which culture? Question 4 assists with case studies. If you could discover what occurred or what was experienced by individuals in a single event, what would that event be? And finally, question 5 for grounded theories. If you could discover a theory for a single phenomenon of living as shared by others, what would that theory be? And so these questions can help you start thinking about what it is that you want to find in your research and how your questions could be positioned to get you to that end game and do so in an approach that is consistent with the types of designs and views of the world that you have. So what makes a good research question? How do you know if the questions that you're developing are acceptable? Well, a good acronym that you could use is this idea of finer maps. And it talks about the different components of a research question that could essentially be used as a checklist for you to go through and determine if these elements seem to be in place for the questions you're asking. These characteristics we look at are feasibility. So as a researcher, do you have the ability to carry out the study that would be required to answer this question? And that encompasses a lot of different aspects. So do you have access to the participants? Do you have the methodology that you need? Do you have the time, the resources to reach the conclusions you would need to answer your question? A good research question should be interesting. Interest is going to help spark motivation on your part as the researcher to conduct this study, and also readers to read your research. As I mentioned earlier, your research should be novel. All right. Ideally, we shouldn't just be copying the ideas of past researchers. We should have our own unique scope as researchers. Now, you can use a study as a template and expand on it. Perhaps you use a different sample, maybe a different instrumentation, or a different way of delivering your intervention. That's going to add to the research. Our research questions should be ethical. And so part of the reason why we have research go through IRB to make sure that we are conducting research and asking questions that respect the rights of our human subjects participants. We want our research questions to be relevant. In other words, that they should be framed within your academic or intellectual disciplines and their current understanding of the field. So developing a question that would have been good 50 years ago is not the same if you do it today. A good research question should be manageable. So the more words in your question doesn't equate to a better question. Questions should be straightforward and to the point of what it is you're trying to do. You could have multiple research questions. Your questions should be appropriate. In other words, that they are logical and scientifically sound. They fit within your current community of practice or your academic disciplines, ways of thinking and researching. Hopefully, you're looking at beyond your theses or dissertations, and you want your research to be publishable. So your questions should have market value. They should reach your target audience. The idea of generalizability becomes important, or the utility of your results to a broad audience and not just a very myopic view. And finally, your research question should be systematic. It should be clear and understood that you will be following a structured or specific way of gathering information based on logical rules, depending on what your epistemological approach is, like we talked about earlier. So use this as a self-checklist when you're considering your research questions to see if you are really truly addressing all that you should be. You also can use the SMART approach. And so we do this a lot with goal setting, but it also applies to research questions. Are your questions specific, measurable, that you're able to collect information to answer them, attainable, relevant, and time-based? I'm assuming for most theses and dissertations, you're not looking at longitudinal research that's going to take multiple years to complete. Consider that when developing your research questions. What is a novel contribution you can make to the research field and still graduate in a timely manner? So here are some of the common problems in developing research questions that I have seen in students with I've worked, and also in attempts authors to try to publish their research. I've spent 11 years as an editor for a national journal. So some of these problems are research questions are too broad. As I said earlier, you don't need to put everything in one question. You don't need to solve all the world's problems in one research study. The way you could fix that is by including fewer variables. Narrow your question in its scope. Another problem may be that you don't have enough participants. As you develop your question, you realize, boy, I'm not going to be able to get enough participants to have the statistical power that I may need to accurately interpret my results. So what you can do is you can expand your inclusion criteria or modify the exclusion criteria. Perhaps you open up your understanding to allow more people the ability to participate in your study. Maybe you add other recruitment sources. You do a combination of recruiting in person, using social media or online requests. A third one is that your question may require methodology that you haven't been trained on. That does not necessarily mean you avoid doing that study, but it means that you're mindful in seeking out collaboration with others or educating yourself, gaining the knowledge that's going to allow you to perform that methodology. Again, and I cannot stress enough, your research question drives your methodology, not the other way around. You may come up with this great study, and then you realize it's too expensive to do. The solution here is to go back to the drawing board. Maybe there are ways that you could cut costs. Maybe you use fewer participants and you need less resources to acquire your sample. Perhaps there are other measures that you could use to assess the variables in your study. Rather than paying for a proprietary instrument, maybe you find one that's equally as valid at low or no cost. And if you're collecting data at multiple points, maybe you consider consolidating or trimming some of your data collection periods to reduce the labor, time, or resources needed to gather that information. And then finally, if your questions are not interesting or deemed to be not relevant, consult with your mentors, your faculty advisors, maybe the peers in your program. In some cases, you may need to go back to the literature and see, what did you miss earlier? What truly is the hot topics in the field today? What is it that collectively as a profession, you're still struggling to understand? Using that to identify those gaps is going to help you establish effective research questions. And so some final tips that I could give you in framing your research questions. When writing them, make sure you reference the population to whom your results will be generalized. So when I was giving you the PICO acronym earlier, having that population is going to be important. When people are conducting literature reviews in the future, and they're putting in their keywords to do the research, you want your study to come up as one that they can use as a potential springboard for their own research. Make those research questions specific. The more specificity you add, the easier it's going to be to assess that question, because you have a finite need for a certain subset of data. Avoid using words or terms that do not add substance to the meaning of your research question. So there used to be this old belief in dissertation writing that a good dissertation had a lot of words in the title. It had to be something where you had to take a breath halfway through it. And that carried over to our research questions too. If it was a really wordy and verbose question and people had to really scratch their heads and look at it again to understand what it said, that must mean it's a good question. Well, that's not necessarily the case anymore. We can be very succinct. Being concise will allow you and your readers to understand what you need to show in your research. Your research questions should avoid discussing implications. your research should be going in almost with a blank slate approach. You may have your hypotheses or your assumptions of what's going to happen, but those biases should not be in the question, nor should the implications. Try not to put the cart before the horse and start talking about what you're going to do as a result of what you find before you actually find it. If you're doing quantitative designs and you have multiple variables or constructs in your study, list them in your research question in the order that they're going to be measured in your study design. That linear flow throughout your research is going to be helpful in allowing your readers to stay in tune with what it is that you're sharing. And then finally, avoid using words such as significant and prove in your research questions. We see this a lot in writing. What may be significant to you may not be significant to your readers. Similarly, prove is a high threshold. You may contribute evidence that gives us some leaning or idea about a topic, but multiple studies may be needed to corroborate your findings and support that what you did find actually is a legitimate truth, going back to what we talked about at the beginning. So typically we try to avoid using those types of words in formulating research questions. Now, I gave you a lot of generalities, as I said in the beginning, because every discipline is going to be slightly different. And working with your doctoral committees or your thesis chairs, they may have specific recommendations based on their preferences, your department's preferences, or even your profession in the field's preferences. So my recommendation for you is to check with those individuals and make sure that what you're doing aligns with the expectations for the work that you're doing. And so that's an overview on framing your research questions and making sure that they line up with what it is that you're trying to do. They honor your perspective as a researcher in terms of how you view the world and what you're hoping to get out of your study. And they include those elements that are going to allow your readers to follow and understand what you're doing in your research. So hopefully that information was helpful for you as you're beginning this journey of becoming a researcher and venturing out, potentially doing your own research for the first time. If there are questions that you have, I'd be glad to answer those for the group.
Hi, Dr. Watson, can you hear me? Dr. Watson, are you able to hear me? Okay, Alex, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not sure if Dr. Watson can hear me.
I can hear you now. Yes, I can now.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Watson. That was really awesome. So I do have a couple questions here in the Q&A for you.
Okay.
The first one is, how can we identify our own bias and what approaches we can try to be more open to or open-minded about how we approach as a research question?
So I think going back to the beginning when I showed you some of those images, thinking about how you gather information. And so really being honest with yourself. In general, every day, how do you gather information? You come across lots of different bits of information that you see on television, read on the internet, hear from others. How do you discern what's truthful for you, what's not truthful? That's going to help you understand some of your bias. So perhaps you're the type of individual that you don't take anything at face value. You always have to go and research it yourself and find evidence that's going to support what you heard. Maybe you're the type of person that you believe in certain trusted sources, and if you hear it from that source, it's important for you. Understanding how you function as a human being is going to help you in the research sense, because then as you go to develop your research, you'll know those preferences you have, and you could try to overcome them or adjust for those in your research design. So if you know that you're the type of individual that has to have multiple sources of data to support what you hear, maybe your design looks at a mixed methods design where you're maybe collecting quantitative information, you're doing some observations, doing some interviews. So really, I would kind of look at it that way. And then after you develop your question, I would go back and look at it. Look at it from an objective perspective. Is there any sense of leadingness in your question? As I talked about at the end there, that you shouldn't really have implications either specifically mentioned in your question or implied in your question. Are you developing questions in a way that you're trying to steer the direction of where you want your research to go? If that seems to be the case and you're picking up on that, perhaps you need to take a step back and look at what may be causing that and how you could reframe that question so that you're going into it with a value neutral perspective as a researcher.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
The next question is, when writing a grant proposal, is there a preferred type of research question, whether that's descriptive, relational, or casual, that is more attractive to the funding agency?
I would say it depends on who the agency is. And so you have grants that could range from internal to external sources and the audience that they apply to. It also really depends if we're talking about federal grants or if we're talking about philanthropic groups that are presenting them. They're going to have different perspectives on the type of research they fund and what that research is going to be based on doing. For the most part, the general rule of thumb that I usually operate with myself is put yourself in the perspective of someone if you were going to be funding the research. If you were going to be writing the check for research, you would hopefully get a good return on investment. In other words, the research that you're funding should lead to a better understanding of a field, or it should pave the way for a more effective way of working with a population. And so based on what those grant initiatives are and what's important for the funding agency, I would structure the question to meet those perspectives. And there's really not one way that's going to be for every approach.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, Dr. Watson, that looks like all the questions that we have for tonight.
Okay.
We want to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate everyone joining us tonight for Framing Research Questions. Just to give everyone a couple of announcements. First, this session recording will be up on the website tomorrow, and Dr. Watson's presentation is already up on the website to view. So if you want to review the recording or any of the materials, they will be on the GROW website. And I put the evaluation link inside the comments, so we really appreciate it if you could take a minute or two to fill out our evaluation to make sure that we're providing you some of the best workshops that we can. And also from this this participation list, we're going to pick 2 to 3 winners that you'll receive some cool Islander goodies. And so if you get an email that you're a winner, I'll definitely give you some more information on that. But Dr. Watson, we really appreciate your time this evening, and thank you so much.
Sure, no problem. Everyone have a great night.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Stay safe.